or even the New World. The gold rush brought thousands of newcomers to strike it rich in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Miners saw the Indian people as a violent threat and an obstacle in the way of untold riches. For the native people, the gold rush era was a time of state-sponsored Indian killing and genocide. It is said that genocide is killing members of a group with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, and let the bloodbath begin of massacres, dislocation, starvation, forced labor, and disease upon the Indians. Now let's talk about an event nicknamed the Bloody Island of 1849. This took place in what's known today as Clear Lake. This is where the Pomo and Whippet tribes lived for centuries, until two white ranchers named Kelly and Stone came along and enslaved the Indian tribes that lived there. The ranchers were cruel and gave little food in return for the Indians' hard labor, so the tribes were starving. Kelsey and Stone were also known for raping and brutally beating the Indians. One night in December of 1849, Indians named Chinook and Axis, along with three others from the Whoopah tribe, had had enough. They snuck into their master's ranch home and killed them. When leaving, they brought food home to the tribes. With 2 white lives lost, it began a revenge-killing spree of Indians. The U.S. Army and volunteer citizens killed more than 1,000 Indians from December to May of 1850. In 1850, an act for government and protection of Indians was passed. This might sound good for the Indians, but it wasn't. It granted white man power to enslave Indians without means of support, and the removal of Indians from traditional lands, separating children and adults from families, languages, and cultures. From 1846 to 1870, the California Indian population dropped from 150,000 to only 30,000. But I forgot, who did they call the savages again?
Hello, I wanted to talk about the fellow African Americans in the Golden Rush era in California. It all started from William Alexander Landstroth, an Afro-Caribbean businessman from Yerba Buena. He was granted 35,000 acres along the south side of American River in the northeastern Sacramento County by Mexican Governor Mitch Tolorena. Landstroth intends to operate a cattle-raising enterprise on the property that would produce beef for sale. Landstroth would die in 1848 before his dream for cattle riches is realized. In 1848, John Marshall discovered gold in the Sutter's Mill in Coloma. Marshall and John Sutter agrees to keep his find a secret, but 6 months later, the word gets out about the discovery of the gold rush in the gold fields in Coloma, and other portions of the Mother Idol begins. Now here is the part I really wanted to talk about: slavery in the gold rush era in California. Even though in the period of the gold rush you would think African Americans slaves were minors, but a significant number of free blacks joined the gold rush. In fact, Rudolph Lapp estimates that 962, only 50% of Africans were slaves in 1850 California. Frederick Douglass, a famous black, encouraged African Americans to go to California, and many slaves got their freedom that way. Usually slaves came from Texas, Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi. Less than 1 out of 10, which is 10% of California's population, were women. The first black California were sailors from the east, whaling ships seeking gold. In fact, they would just aboard their ships in the docks and leave, for other sailors would have to get the ships out of the docks for other ships to arrive. Most successful blacks in California were not miners. Some had to provide supplies and service for the miners, such as tools, haircuts, food items, cooks, rooms, baths, laundry service, and entertainment. African American cooks were known to be skilled, talented, and were much in demand. They got wealthy because supplies and services needed were often sold at a very, very, very high price. An egg could go as high as $1, bread $1 per slice, a blanket $100, a butcher knife $30, a tin pan for gold washed went as high as $30. The average of a wage for a miner was only $10 a day. In 1850, when California joined the United States as the 31st and the freest state, many former slaves gained their freedom. But the lack of government oversight allowed slavery to flourish in certain regions. In 1852, fugitive slave law made it illegal for slaves to flee their own masters in California. All African Americans in California born free or formerly enslaved lived under a constant threat of arrest.
Once the Chinese heard news of the gold rush, an immense amount of them traveled to California. The majority of these Chinese immigrants were unskilled male laborers who were in search of a better life for themselves and for their families. The Chinese tended to often live in groups and were very different from others in the area. For example, they had darker skin, they were not Christian, and they had unique eating habits and clothing. They were also extremely peaceful and very hardworking, which were often appreciated by Californians at that time. Yet, as time drew on, many of the Chinese were viewed with such hatred because of the decline of gold in the area. Many viewed the Chinese as being responsible for the decline of the gold, and many protests and rallies and hatreds. Many Chinese were often treated violently, and this was also supported by the government at that time. In addition to their harsh treatments, the Chinese had to face other obstacles as well. The Chinese were often given difficult jobs and the dirty jobs that not many Californians wanted to work at that time. Many politicians, such as John Bigler, the governor of California from 1852 to 56, suggested the decreasing in the amount of Chinese immigrants. As a result, the foreign miners' tax was passed, in which Chinese had to pay $3 a month. Overall, the acceptance of Chinese in California shifted from acceptance into violence and hatred as the gold rush progressed, and Chinese immigrants began to have a reputation as being unreliable. When the Chinese first immigrated to California, many Californians were accepting of their presence, and they were actually grateful for their presence there. Since the Chinese had a reputation of being hard workers, Californians were extremely willing to support. When the Chinese first immigrated to California, many were actually accepted by Californians in the area, since the Chinese had a reputation of being hard workers and were willing to take the jobs that many Californians would not, such as the dirty jobs, such as cleaning and doing other small tasks. In addition, the Chinese were paid around $26 each month to perform these. Many Chinese became personal laborers for some of the miners at that time. In addition to this, they also started their own businesses, such as restaurants and hotels, where weary miners would come and rest for the night.
James W. Marshall found the first trace of gold in the American River. With this discovery, this led many white men from eastern U.S. to come over and work long hours for low wages and be exploited by large gold mining companies. They did not strike rich, and they were not very good at mining, which led them to be very cruel and rude to many of the different immigrants that came over of different race. And with the different races, such as Native Americans, Chinese, and Mexican men, white men felt threatened due to the other ethnic groups being good at mining, and this led to many violent and brutal attacks and tactics such as genocide, in which 120,000 Native Americans were killed, and the white men also invaded Mexican land and destroyed their crops and cattle. In addition, many whites also brought their slaves along with them, and the government merely ignored it. During this time, the slaves were still getting treated poorly and were forced to work harder than ever in order to find the most gold, only for the benefit of their slave owner and to make them more wealthy. And now my main focus is on the treatment of Mexicans during the gold rush. California was a part of Mexico until 1848, so many Mexicans came over looking for gold because they believed they still had territories in California. Mexicans were good at mining due to their professionalism and experience, and in the beginning they outnumbered Americans. Because of this, Americans were scared of losing their status and privilege to Spanish-speaking immigrants, which led to harsh treatment towards Mexicans. They were harassed and assaulted and had things imposed on them such as the foreign miners tax, which charged $20 a month for Spanish immigrants to mine, and if they refused to pay the fine, white Americans had an excuse to drive them out of the rich mining areas. Due to taxation and violence, an estimated 15,000 Mexican miners fled to different areas. Rancheros were successful at selling beef to miners, so they started to overproduce and overgraze. Overproduction of beef caused an increase of selling price, therefore leading to an economic depletion. In 1850, 64% of Mexicans owned land, and by 1890, only 5% owned land. After years of harassment and violent acts taken against Mexicans' land, along with their crops and cattle by the white Americans, the gold rush eventually led to Mexicans gaining U.S. citizenship and being promised that the land would be respected. This promise was not kept because of the homesteaders who did not own land of their own in the East, came and overran the land that belonged to the Mexicans and took everything they had away from them, such as their crops, land, and pride, due to broken promises and selfishness of the homesteaders.